It's common in programs to have to validate the kind of input your user is sending to you to make sure that the input is usable for the purposes that you want to put the data to. So the assignment here is to do a little validation, and typically one of the things we want to do is put our validation into a separate function if we can do that. So I'm going to walk you through kind of a basic setup, and then you're going to do it in the particular way that I've laid out in the assignment. So a basic setup would look something like this. We want to get some information from our user. So I've made a new Python file, validation Python file here. We're going to go ahead and use the built-in input function to get some information from the user. Let's call it username. Now, instead of going right on into our validation here, we're actually going to write a function for our validation. In fact, let's do this just for the sake of argument. Let's go ahead and define our function for validation before we actually look for the user input. Now, I'm writing a general function, valid user input, validate, I should probably write validate user input. I'm writing and I should probably better. I'm writing a general function. Generally, what we might want to do is actually validate piece by piece. And we might want to write other functions that validate piece by piece and then call them all inside of a larger function. So we only have to call one function when we want to validate user input. So, because remember, we want to kind of keep to that rule if we can of that function doing one thing. For the purposes of this assignment, though, you're only really going to be validating for one thing. So it's okay to write one function for this. So we're going to have this take the user input. And then we're going to validate it. Now, in the assignment, I'm going to ask you to validate the user input based on whether or not it starts with an uppercase letter. And there are going to be a couple of things you're going to want to look into possibly. First of all, is it letters at all? Is there a way that we can know whether it's letters at all? And then, how can we test whether it's capitalized properly? How can we test to see whether it starts with an uppercase letter? There are a couple of different ways of doing this. And I'm going to leave it to you to sort of figure out how to do it. But let's for a moment just play with what if it's a letter or letters or not. So let's say I just wanted to test to see whether this was letters or not. I could do there is a built-in function that you can run on strings called isAlpha. So we could do this. If user input dot isAlpha. Now you'll notice it's not auto-completing here. And the built-in function isAlpha is going to return a Boolean for us, true or false, based on whether this is letters. That's what isAlpha method does, and it only works on strings. One of the reasons it's not auto-completing here is because we have not explicitly said that user input is going to be string. I'm going to return to that point in a second. But if it is alpha, we're going to go ahead and return true. Else, let's return false. And we would set that up just like this. Now I'm going to go ahead and call the function here. And I want to print out whatever it returns. So validate user input, passing it the username. Just like that. Okay. So now if we run that file, it says enter username. If I run Mr. Huber as my username, it comes out false. Why did it come out false? Looks like it's mostly letters to me. Well, that's the problem. It's mostly letters. If you'll notice in there, I actually put in a period. That's not a letter. Period's not a letter, therefore it doesn't work. If I were to just put in Huber, I get a true result because Huber is all letters. We could also try numbers. and we're going to get false again because it's numbers. Now, we know that when we call the input function, it's always going to return a string. It's always going to return some version of a string. But it might not always return letters. It might not always return, I don't know. There might be some other error that we have to deal with. So it might not be a bad idea to go ahead and change this into something that we know we can work with as a string. What I mean by that is it might not be a bad idea to go ahead and use a try block here and in your code, basically meaning if I can't test is alpha, meaning if for some reason this isn't a string, again, we're taking user input. It seems really reasonable that it's always going to be a string, but for some reason, if it's not a string, we can use this try except block. And that way, if this test fails, if this isn't a string, right, and we can't run is alpha on it, well then what do we want to do? Let's go ahead and return false anyway, right? And in this way, we've kind of handled a possible error. And let me show you what that possible error could look like. Now here I've changed my code. I've said username equals 5. 5 is not a string, 5 is an integer. Is alpha would fail if I tried to run it on the number 5. But this case, the program's not failing. It's just going to return false because of this fix we put in. If I go back in time for a second and I take this fix out, if I take out this error handling here, just like that, and I run this program again, you'll notice I'm going to get an error now. I'm getting an error because username is being overwritten by the integer 5, and integers don't have an is alpha method on that type of object. It's only on strings. So that's why having that little bit of extra error handling in there is not necessarily a bad idea. Again, we can reasonably expect that this is always going to be a string, but in the case that our program might in the future change the way it's working with this validation function, providing this is not a bad idea. And it also gives us good practice for the try except block. Now, I've done a function here that validates whether or not we're dealing with letters. Your assignment is to write a similar function, but it should also validate whether or not those letters begin with a capital letter. And I'll give you a hint here. Strings also have, we've talked about this before, strings also have a method embedded in them. I'll do it in the comment here. We could theoretically use user input dot title, which is going to capitalize the first letter of each word. And if the and assuming there aren't more than one words, right? So for a username, typically they're one word long. But it'll capitalize the first letter of each word, which may give us something to work with if we want to see if our original input did have a capital letter or for its first letter, or if it did not. So that's kind of the challenge I'm putting to you in your assignment. Write a function that is going to test whether the user input starts with a capital letter. All right, good luck.